Hi everyone. I wanted to respond to a couple of comments left on my recent video about the Chicago kidnapping. And I want the person that I'm responding to here to know that I don't mean any ill will, obviously, by responding to your comments. I very much appreciate you engaging me in the way you have. I've spent a lot of time thinking about the comments that you left. The reason I wanted to talk about them is they highlight for me a bit of a problem with regards to my previous videos about religiosity versus rationality and the state of sort of atheism today. And also fast forward to, of course, the Chicago kidnapping and the ramifications for this kind of thinking when it comes to these kind of events. I think this kind of event is really important because it allows us to have a real lifeboat scenario that we can apply our moral principles to in order to try to figure out, what the heck we think is going on and what we think we can glean from it and what it means for the way we treat one another and the way we govern ourselves and that sort of thing. So the commenter goes by the name Trigger Warning. So trigger warning. And they stated this: you are struggling because you are trying to hold on to morality in the light of atheism. Prescriptive views are the root of your angst. Be descriptive and accept it for what it is, and all the issues go away. The world is not supposed to be the way you think it should be. I think what I'll do is I'll read my response and Trigger Warning's final comment before I engage in dissecting the comments too much farther. So I responded and I said, a purely descriptive approach offers us nothing in terms of how to treat one another, not even how we would prefer to be treated. I would submit that we can define a secular morality and that it can be prescriptive, logically. What you are describing, at least as I perceive it, makes governments, laws, and human interaction all arbitrary and subjective, in other words, meaningless in terms of any kind of judgment. I see zero practical use for that approach, and further, I don't see almost anyone behaving as though this is the way things are. Even thugs have a code, and they project that code onto others, indicating some sort of belief that it is objectively valid. Essentially, we all either believe in objective ethics, or we are all being inconsistent and dishonest in the way we express our subjective morality. Cheers. And Trigger Warning responded by saying, I know you want to define your secular morality as an alternative to the various religious moralities, but there's one big problem you keep running into. You don't bother to define what a morality is or what its purpose is. You gloss over that every time and just start defining a specific morality that you like. What you end up with is a morality that is no different from the religious moralities you rail against. And then you wonder why everybody doesn't accept your morality, just like the religious folk don't understand why not everybody accepts their morality. What you just have to get over is that your morality governs you and only you. When you expect others to follow your morality, you are going to be disappointed. Okay, and so it seems to me what Trigger Warning is describing here is that morality is purely subjective, that there are no objective right and wrong, there's no objective good and evil. And that's something that really bothers me, again, in terms of a practical use for any of these terms in the first place. If morality is purely subjective, then really what we're talking about is preferences. I have personal preferences. I like this, I don't like that. And if I'm going to be consistent at all, I have to recognize that everyone else has theirs as well. And unless I'm going to somehow make the case that I am somehow superior to other people, and even Trigger Warning here admits this, that all I can do is have my morality govern me. And this forms no basis for the legitimacy of any government, any laws, any kind of rules within interpersonal relationships. And that's the biggest problem I have. I think morality, in the same way that math describes the relationship of objects in the real world to one another, morality, more importantly, describes the relationship of human beings and our interactions with one another. So yes, in that sense, it's prescriptive or descriptive, but I think it has a prescriptive component there that's necessary for it to be meaningful in any way, because it would almost be as though math were simply used to describe objects in the real world, but we could not have any calculations. We couldn't have computations. We couldn't take 3 eggs and 3 eggs and combine them to determine the new number of eggs. They would just always be 3 eggs over here, 3 eggs over there. It's completely descriptive. There's no utilization there. And so I do want to go through Trigger Warning's comments individually just to sort of dissect them a little bit further. Now, I think what often happens with atheists is there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance that exists when we're talking about the subject of morality. I've seen this time and time again. Many atheist channels have gotten to the point where they said, I'm fed up, I don't want to, we're not talking about morality anymore, which is very strange to me because to me, it's kind of all about morality. Right? All of these atheist channels are talking about Christians are doing this, Christians are doing that. Sometimes Muslims are doing this, Muslims are doing that. This is wrong, that's wrong. We got to fight against this. These people shouldn't be doing that. That's all morality. What is the validity of saying that a person should or shouldn't be able to do a certain thing and then saying we don't want to talk about morality and it's all subjective? You're then only expressing an opinion, essentially. And I think the reason that this cognitive dissonance exists and this frustration that atheists have is because they've gotten this idea that if they submit to an objective morality, that they're essentially submitting to a religious doctrine. That the only prescriptive, objective moral standards that could possibly exist have to come from an omniscient, omnipresent being through some tablets or something. And I think that's where the uneasiness comes from, is if they admit that there's some objective, identifiable code of ethics out there, that this would necessarily mean that they're wrong in terms of their religious views, their atheism. And I don't think this is the case. I think that we can derive a secular set of ethics. And I think the list of prescriptive elements there is very, very small, but it's very important for us to have any way, any validity to telling someone else what they ought or ought not to do. If we're going to be honest and we're going to be consistent, we're going to conform to the idea that morality is subjective, then we ought to either button our lips when it comes to what other people ought or ought not do, or we ought to at least be honest and say, it's my preference, it's my opinion, it's my belief that I would prefer you didn't do that thing or you did that thing. So Trigger Warning says, you're struggling because you're trying to hold on to morality in the light of atheism. I think that's a cue to this idea that morality, objective morality, is something for the religious. And in light of atheism, I'm trying to hold on to this. Prescriptive views are the root of your angst. In other words, there's nothing prescriptive about morality here, and you're trying to hold on to these pseudo-religious version of morality, which does have prescriptive views. And to Trigger Warning and everyone else, I would say this, keep in mind, I'm not struggling when it comes to morality, and not internally anyway. I mean, I'm on a quest to figure it all out, but I don't struggle in terms of my own code of ethics or anything like that. And it's not in the light of atheism. It's not like it's a juxtaposition between that and religiosity. And part of the reason is because I was raised pretty much completely irreligious. I didn't have any of these ideas force-fed on me. I was raised for the formative years of my life quite remotely. My parents had both had a religious upbringing, and they'd made a conscious decision not to impose that on their children. So while I had some very vague ideas about what religion was, and I was sort of aware that my parents had rejected all of that, I didn't really understand the doctrines. I didn't understand the carrot and the stick, the heaven, the hell, the threat narratives that exist, and I didn't understand this claimed objective morality. And the one thing I would say about most religions is the morality is not objective, it's completely subjective. It's subject to the will of God. It's subject to the mind of God. These are commandments. They are not moral absolutes in terms of them existing in the way that other things exist in the real world. Even the relationship between objects. Because I think we can see sometimes in religious texts that this morality can shift a little bit. But Trigger warning goes on to say, be descriptive and accept it for what it is and all the issues go away. I'm not sure how all the issues go away. I think assuming that morality is only descriptive, which I'm not even sure what that really means other than I'm not sure what that means in light of morality being subjective. But the issues don't go away. That's the entire problem. That's why we have discussions about morality when kidnappings, killings, tortures, rapes, theft, property crimes, when all of those things happen, we engage in a moral argument. Even the people who are morally wrong, like the Gavi Kodzos of this world, he's attempting to make a moral argument. We suffered all these injustices, which is a moral argument, in the past, and so I support these guys doing this thing now. This is a moral justification, so he thinks. So if you're just purely descriptive, the problems don't go away. I think they're compounded. I think that's the crux of where we are. I don't think that statement could be more wrong. Not only that, but this illustrates the problem with being morally wrong, with using bad logic or pronouncements from a religious text to make bad moral decisions. As we can witness throughout our human history, they can have incredibly terrible ramifications. And so we're all making morally absolute statements all the time. Whether we claim that morality is subjective or not, I run into it all the time by people who say that morality is only subjective. We're all making morally absolute statements, and it's very important that we're arriving at those conclusions for the right reasons. The world is not supposed to be the way you think it should be, and I would agree with that. I'm not saying that I think the world should be the way my view of the world is. What I'm saying is I think we need to identify the way the world actually is. So yes, there's a descriptive element to it, but the descriptive element can define the prescriptive element. Because the nature of the way people interact with one another and the ramifications of that, that's the descriptive element, can help inform our prescriptive pronouncements about those things. And again, I would say, I think, in terms of a secular morality, I think the prescriptive list is a very, very short one to do with property crimes, or crimes against a person, crimes against, coercion, rape, theft, property crimes, murder, those sorts of things. I think outside of that, because of the same descriptive element, I don't think we can say much. I think it's sort of like all is permissible so long as it doesn't infringe upon another person's right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, personal autonomy, freedom, blah, 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 blah. And so it's not in light of atheism, though. I think that's really important, at least not as a juxtaposition to a religious moral doctrine. So further to this end, trigger warning goes on to say, I know you want to define your secular morality as an alternative to the various religious moralities, but there's one big problem you keep running into. And again, I would say no. It's not as an alternative because I wasn't raised that way. I'm not seeking an alternative. I'm seeking the truth. I'm seeking an empirical, rational, reason-based, again, almost an interpersonal version of mathematics to define and then prescribe morally a set of ethics that are in some ways insurmountable. They're unchallengeable, that if you attempt to, in other words, much in the same way that the statement, there's no such thing as an absolute, that is a logically incoherent statement. It's logically falls flat on its face. That's what I'm talking about. Something that we can define that you can't logic and reason your way out of. You can't find a flaw in the argument. That's what I'm talking about. Now, of course, in that reference, I mean to liken the arguments for secular morality to the positive affirmation of absolutes, not the attempt at the negation, and that any attempt to negate the absolute actually only ends up affirming absolutes. Now he goes on to say, he or she goes on to say, you don't bother to define what a morality is or what its purpose is. You gloss over that every time and just start defining a specific morality that you like. Well, in my defense, we haven't gotten that deep into the topic of morality yet. I think there's a general understanding that, I think if we're being honest, that what a morality's purpose is to define and to somewhat prescribe the way people should behave with respect to other people. And morality is about human interaction. It's about the preferred way to behave, essentially. And we could get into that further if we want to launch into a discussion of secular morality, but that's not really where we are. I mean, I think essentially what I'm saying is when we're talking about morality in light of, say, a terrorist attack or this particular Chicago kidnapping or whatnot, we all have a rudimentary understanding of what we're trying to achieve when we bring ethics into the discussion, right? We're trying to determine, is this a good action? Is this a bad action? Is this permissible? Is this something we should allow? Is this something that we should punish, et cetera, et cetera? But if you want to get into the topic of morality, I'd be more than happy to. It's often very difficult to get atheists to talk about morality for the reasons I've mentioned previously. What you end up with is a morality that is no different from the religious moralities you rail against. And then you wonder why everybody doesn't accept your morality, just like religious folk don't understand why not everybody accepts their morality. And I could not disagree more. The whole point is, if the morality that I end up with was no different than the morality, the Christian morality, for instance, or religious morality that I rail against, then I would be forced to face that uncomfortable realization that I'm being inconsistent. And I spend a lot of time trying to make sure that I'm not inconsistent. That's the most basic element of logic, I think, that we can hold on to. I need to be consistent. If I hold this idea and they are incompatible, then I have to figure out, that's a good sign, that's a clue to me that there's something wrong with one of the arguments, one of the ideas. The inconsistency is the most important element to the whole thing. I would disagree also that the morality that I end up with is like the religious moralities that I rail against. You don't know what my moral principles are. For instance, I don't hold a moral principle that says that I should hold no other gods than this particular God. I don't hold the moral principle that says that atheism is immoral, or apostasy is immoral, or blaspheming God is immoral. I don't hold the moral principle that homosexuality is abhorrent. There's many of the moral principles, and I also don't hold the moral principle that genocide is acceptable, that I don't hold the moral principle that all mankind is inherently flawed, irrevocably inherently flawed, and must have some sort of a salvation. The majority of the religious moral pronouncements that are held by Christianity and Islam and a lot of other faiths, I reject. I reject them partially because I think they're logically inconsistent. I think they're irrational. And actually, the funny thing is, the Reformation of religions has shown us this. The Reformation of Christianity, where a lot of the more brutal and barbaric portions of the text, Christians of today in the Western world don't really adhere to those moral pronouncements. So you say that religious people don't understand why not everybody accepts their morality. Well, they've been forced to change partially because of that. Partially because a lot of this stuff, I think, through our moral evolution has kind of come to be realized on its face that it's actually immoral. It's not that it's not even that it's morally neutral. It's certainly not moral. It's actually immoral. And so the reformation of religions to kind of distance themselves from certain portions of their own religious texts has been an admission that there is some kind of objective, natural ethics that we can determine. And when we put the religious texts through that lens, we realize that some of those tenets are untenable morally. I've got way more to say on this. Again, this is something that I'm very interested in. I spend a lot of time thinking about secular morality and what its purpose is and what we can do with it and what a world looks like where morality is purely subjective. So I could go on and on and on, and I'm not going to do that. I'm going to finish this sentence here because the video is already getting pretty long. So trigger warning goes on to say, what you have to get over is that your morality governs you and only you. When you expect others to follow your morality, you are going to be disappointed. And I would agree, but it's not my morality. That's the whole point. That would be like calling it my math. in terms of the morality that I believe exists. This descriptive element of the interaction of human beings with one another and the ramifications of the results of those interactions, and the prescriptive element. It's not my morality. Now, I would agree that obviously if I expect everyone to act morally, I'm going to be disappointed because not everyone is going to act morally. But disappointment is not a disproof of anything. It's an admission, it's a recognition that not everyone is going to behave morally. But it does nothing to disprove whether or not those acts were moral or immoral. And to say that my morality governs me and only me, again, it's not my morality. I don't get to choose that murder is moral. It's moral or immoral of its own accord. It is an objective thing. So it's not my morality. And yes, I understand. If I expect everyone to behave morally, then I'm going to be disappointed, as I was and as I have been, with watching the way people behave and the poor logic that people use and that sort of thing. It's interesting because to me, the whole point of all of this, and I had talked a lot about morality in videos probably as a year and a half ago now or so, and people kind of got burned out on it then. I had said at the time, I'd gotten involved in this conversation about morality, and people kept saying, it's all subjective, it's all subjective. There's no truly objective right or wrong, evil or good, anything like that. And I said, I wish that we had engaged in this conversation as a result of a really heinous act that everybody had universally rejected as bad, as immoral, and had proposed all sorts of punishment for the perpetrators of that immoral thing. Because it would have been a lot easier for me to show the hypocrisy of people claiming that morality is only subjective while at the same time, rejecting this act as reprehensible and declaring the people as immoral and that sort of thing. And also to lay bare for everyone the complete uselessness of even discussing a subjective morality, because it doesn't give us anything. There's no practical use for it whatsoever. We might as well strike the word from our language. It need not exist. Well, here we have an instance where there is a pretty morally reprehensible act that we all, I think, pretty much universally reject as being immoral. We reject those people as having perpetrated something terrible. And this could be, it doesn't matter, it could be them, it could be Omar Mateen, it could be Dylan Roof, it could be any of these people who have perpetrated really heinous acts upon their fellow man. And to say that, my morality informs only me is useless to us. So I express to you that I don't like that. So what? Does that give me any ability to, again, as I said earlier, the very foundation of our rule of law crumbles under something like that. So I would say, as secularists, as atheists, we are battling this idea with other religious people that their moral pronouncements are largely invalid. There's some that we agree with, but there's lots of them that we disagree with. And in some ways, trigger warning was correct. We are looking for something to replace it with as a group, I guess. And we've replaced a lot of Christian morals with secular morals. The U.S. is still really a secular nation. There's this big battle there. But we don't, the Christians like to say it's a Christian nation. It's based on Christian fundamentals. I'd like to know where the law is that says that the most important commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, that's not in the U.S. Constitution. It's been replaced by the freedom of religion and the freedom of no religion. How is it that you tell someone they ought not do something, and if they do something, we're going to punish them for it, and then say you need to remove the prescriptive element from your morality? It's completely inconsistent. And as I said back when we were having this discussion on my channel, and a lot of people kept saying, they kept towing this line, it's only subjective, it's only subjective. I don't know how you make that case. And I said, yeah, but how is it that you say a woman has a right to choose, or that person should not commit murder, et cetera, et cetera? They actually sort of admitted to me that they were really just kind of, well, I'm just expressing my personal preference. Well, A, I don't know how it is that you tell other people then how they should behave based on your personal preferences. Trigger warning said in this very video, in this very comment, your morality informs you and only you. Then you ought to be honest about it and zip it. Or express that you would prefer that people not. I would prefer you guys don't kidnap that guy and torture him and, lace him with racial epithets and things like that. Political terrorism. I'd prefer you don't do that. We're not honest with our language, though, because we come out and we say, that is wrong. And I called people on this. I said, language is useless to us. Language is, the function of language is for us to communicate with each other. And language is useless to us if we keep being dishonest with our words. Instead of saying that is wrong, you ought to be honest and say, I don't really like that. And people got into all kinds of mental gymnastics with that by saying, well, it's cumbersome and clumsy to say I don't like murder rather than murder is wrong. You're not even being honest, I think, with yourself if you believe that way. So I'll close this video just by saying I do appreciate Trigger Warning engaging me on this topic, because I do think it's critical, especially with a lot of people now, again, railing against atheists for some of their current stands and the way they behave, and the geopolitical and geo-religious things that are happening right now. Atheists got to get their act together when it comes to morality, because we're going to have a tough time in the public space trying to reject religious morality if we don't have a firm grasp on it ourselves, and we're running around saying morality is all subjective. Because really, if morality is all subjective and the religious people outnumber you, then you better get ready to subject, right? And that's kind of another issue that I have with this whole idea of morality is subjective, because atheists have said to me, morality is all subjective. And I say, well, how is it that you come up with a law or a system of government? And they say, well, collectively, respectfully, subjectively, or something like that. In other words, basically mob rule. They're saying, well, if enough of us get together, then we can just sort of impose our will on the minority. And I would hope that those same people hold the moral principle that mob rule is immoral. And if they don't now, they will when they're in the minority. And that's something I think you really need to think about. Reason, evidence, logic, all those things are supposed to rule the day. When it comes to morality, we seem to have a real disconnect. And I think secular people, atheists, need to get their act together when it comes to this idea of morality, or we're going to get steamrollered. We made a lot of progress. I say we. I didn't have anything to do with it. This, the Enlightenment and all that stuff happened long before I came along. We're reaping the benefits of it now, and we better not let it slip through our fingers. And that's why I made the video where I was railing against people like Stefan Molyneux, who is an atheist, for going back to the dark side of praising religiosity. Yeah, he was praising religiosity because of the temporary reformed views of modern day Christians, and the fact that they're definitely religion light compared to some of the more fundamentalist views and some of the more fundamentalist Islamic views. But the problem that I have with that is that's embracing, once again, irrationality, because Molyneux himself would propose that those ethics are not derived rationally. They're derived as prescriptions from some text written likely by other human beings at some point in time. And if we bend to the cause of irrationality instead of trying to maintain rationality at all times and demanding a rational explanation for anything that we're being expected to swallow and behave such as and be subject to, we're going to be in very big trouble. Thanks for watching.